Assalamu alaikum guys, welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're going to complete the verbal section of this PDF. So this is going to be part 1 of this PDF, and then the next video we're going to complete part 2, which is the quantitative section. So as I said, we're going to focus on the verbal section, and this PDF will cover all the sections of the verbal section. This PDF from the QIYAS website, they give you this PDF that has the quantitative and verbal section. It gives you the nature of the test and some sample questions. So let's get right into it. So it has 21 pages, and I will skip into the 7th page right away because I'm going to start with the practice problems right away, and I will provide the link to this document in the description. So if you want, you can go ahead and read this by yourself. Okay, let's get right into it. So we're starting with analogies. They say analogy items have 2 words in the heading of the question that are somehow related. The options A to D have 4 other pairs of words. Where each pair is also somehow related. To answer the question correctly, you have to identify the pair where the relationship is the same as in the heading. Here is an example. Cold, hot. Handsome, young. Summer, spring. Beautiful, ugly. Complete, total. So cold and hot. Cold and hot are antonyms. We're supposed to look for the antonyms. So handsome and young could be more closely related, so we're going to cancel that out. Summer and spring are not very opposites of each other. Complete and total are synonyms, and B is the answer because beautiful is the opposite of ugly, and hot is the cold of and hot is the opposite of cold. Okay, so it says, in this question, the relationship between the words in the heading hot and cold is that they are opposites. So yeah, that's exactly what we said. This is like basically explaining and justifying their answer, which is what I told you, that they're antonyms, they're opposites. Okay. So they're telling you that analogous relationships can also include part to whole, cause and effect, problem to solution, material to product, and process to product, but it's not limited to that. So we can keep those in mind. We can keep those types of relationship in mind when doing the problems below. Okay, so let's get started. In the following questions, there are a pair of capitalized words followed by 4 choices marked A, B, C, D. Choose the pair of words whose relationship is most similar to that expressed by the capitalized pair and mark your choice. Okay, so string and guitar. A string is a part of a guitar, so we're supposed to look for part of a whole. So we're identifying the relationship. This is part of a whole. Okay. Is cup part of a saucer? No. Is button a part of a whole? No. And is wax a part of a crayon? No, because you use wax to make crayons, meaning that it's not really like a part of it, because it's saying that a string is part of a guitar, meaning it's like a piece. And is a feather part of a bird? Yes, because it is a part of a whole. Okay, now let's look at question number 2. Question number 2 says complicated, sophisticated, and we're supposed to look for the closely related word. So it says elaborate, complete, cheap, gross, costly, expensive, tall, and long. Okay, so the relationship between complicated or sophisticated are basically synonyms. They're basically synonyms. So we're supposed to look for synonyms. So it's not C, because we can automatically cross C out. And it's not A, because elaborate is not a synonym of complete. Why? Because elaborate means involving many carefully arranged parts or details, and complete means it's something that's complete and fully developed. So it's not A. Is it B or is it D? Now we have to compare costly, expensive, tall, long. We can see that the answer is B. Why? Because the relationship between costly and expensive are basically the same thing as complicated and sophisticated, because they are like synonyms. They're closely related, and it is not D. You might be like tricked into choosing D. It's not D because tall and long, although they kind of are closely related, they are not the closest thing to this relate. Number 3 says wind, sandstorm. So we're supposed to identify the relationship between wind and a sandstorm. So a sandstorm could have winds, meaning it could be something like a part of a whole. Okay, so earthquake, tsunami. Yes, because it kind of is like a part of a whole, because in order for tsunamis to happen, earthquakes must occur. Okay, so planets and stars. Not really, because planets are not in stars, they're not part of the whole. This is kind of like the opposite of what we're looking for. So, no, they switched it up for B. Okay, so C, fossils and rocks. Well, no, not really, because they kind of have a different relationship rather than a part of a whole. And fire and spark. No, because again, they switched the relationship that we're looking for, meaning that the answer is automatically A. Okay, now let's move on to question number 4. Question number 4 says palm, tree. Okay, so it's basically kind of like one word, so we're basically looking for something that makes sense in a one word setting. So coconut, olive. Could that make sense? Yes, it could, but in this matter, it does not relate to palm and tree. Okay, so is it safari and giraffe? No. Why? Because you cannot basically make one word of it when you think of it. Needle and saw is needle and Sue. No, meaning our answer is automatically C. Why? Because you can say rose flower, like just like palm tree. Okay, so let's move on to question number 5. Question number 5 says worker, employee. It's basically synonyms, so we're supposed to look for the synonym relationship. So friend, cousin, no, because they are not synonyms. They're two different relationships. Loan and money, no, because it's describing the thing that you can do with money. Book, paper, no, because it's a part of a whole. Is it road, path? Yes, because they are basically synonyms. A road is basically a path. A worker is basically an employee. Okay, now let's move on to the next question. Okay, so the next question is a different section. It's the contextual errors, and it says one of the 4 highlighted words in each of the following passages does not fit the meaning of the text. Choose the word and mark your choice. So contextual errors consist of short text, 2 to 3 sentences with 4 words and boldface. One of these words is a new one that replaces a different word that was in the text. The new word is incorrect for this context. To answer the question correctly, you must identify the word that does not fit the context. Here's an example. So it says 2 causes are available for trading. Private and public. Individual traders tend to use the private option, where the proprietor will take some responsibility for the items. Okay, so now we're supposed to extract the error. But beware, don't waste your time trying to replace the error, but rather just try to identify the error and mark it as your option. So 2 causes are available for trading. That doesn't really make sense. There are no causes available for trading. Maybe there's 2 options available for trading, private and public. So this could be the answer. Individual traders, no, this is not the answer because that makes sense. Traders tend to use the private option, where the proprietor, well, we know that a proprietor is like the owner of a business or a holder of a property, so no, it makes sense in this context. Will take some responsibility. Yeah, so a business owner does take responsibility, so we can automatically infer that the answer is A. And you can look at their explanation. So they said they chose A, the correct answer, because you're, oh yeah, so they actually did put the word options. But that's what I put too. Yeah, so basically A is correct. Let's move on to question number 6. As a data analyst, you will join a team that analyzes research data for anomalies and present findings to people within and outside the company. A graduate with an eye for detail and love of working with figures would be ideal. Confident communication matters. are also vital. Okay, so basically, we're supposed to find the error. Does research make sense in this context? Yes, it does, meaning it's not the answer. Does findings make sense for this context? Yes, because as a research team, you're supposed to be finding stuff. Okay, does working make sense in this context? Yes, a graduate with an eye for detail and loving of work with the figures would be ideal. Yes, so D is the answer. Why? Because confident communication matters are also vital. That doesn't make sense. Why? Because they just said that they are vital, so why would you need to include matters? You're basically restating it twice in the same sentence, which is not something that's usually done. Okay, now let's move on to question number 7. Question number 7 says, after 8 years of grit and determination, Russell and Janet Harris have succeeded in booking a derelict water tower into a spacious family home. The road to success was long and arduous. Okay, so here we're supposed to identify the contextual error. So first, let's look. After 8 years of grit and determination, yes, it makes sense in this context, so we can cross this out. Russell and Janet Harris have succeeded in booking a derelict tower into a spacious family home. Well, you're not really booking a water tower, so this might not be the answer, so let's look into a spacious family home. This kind of makes sense because when you have a family home, it should be rather spacious and comforting. And arduous. People might trip over this word and just choose it because they're not sure what it means. So, but arduous means involving or requiring strenuous effort. So basically something that's difficult or it's like tiring to do. So no, it's not the answer. Why? Because the road to success was long and arduous. It makes sense. The road to success is very tiring and hard, meaning that the answer is B. Okay, so for many examples, the question of how our minds work was left to theologians and philosophers. But at the beginning of the 20th century, a new science, experimental psychology, emerged. While emerge makes sense in this context, examples does not really make sense in this context. Philosophers make sense because theologian is a person who basically engages in an expert of theology, and philosophers basically have same closely related relationship. And beginning because but at the beginning of the 20th century makes sense because they're talking about the start of the 20th century, which is when these findings emerged, meaning that the answer is A. Why? Because for many examples doesn't make sense. We can say for many years the question of how our mind work was left to theologians and philosophers, or for many centuries. Okay, so let's move on to question number 9. Question number 9 says, bushcraft is the art of using the resources provided by our natural environment to survive and thrive in the great outdoors, and combines the knowledge of how to best use the plants and animals at your disposal with some basic bushcraft tools to make an outdoor living easier and more believable. Well, honestly, we can choose believable right away. We can choose D right away because that doesn't make sense in the context, right? With some basic bushcraft tools to make outdoor living easier and more believable. No, because you're not trying to just persuade others that you know how to, take care of bush and have some bushcraft. No, you're trying to actually learn it, and you're trying to actually make it easier for you and more feasible to be a bushcrafter. So we can automatically say that D is the answer. So let's move on to question number 10. Question number 10 says a new study has highlighted the distressing scope of yet another threat to coral reefs: plastics. Researchers analyzed more than 124,000 corals from 159 reefs. Almost everywhere they looked, they saw bits of plastic. Quote unquote, we rejected chairs, chip wrappers, Q-tips, garbage bags, water bottles, and old nappies, said a marine disease ecologist at Cornell University. So a new study highlighted. That makes perfect sense in this context, so we can cross it out. researchers analyzed more than it makes sense because they have to analyze for the mistakes, or they analyze the plastics to see if there are any plastics. We rejected chairs. You can't really since you found them everywhere, the water bottles, the napkins, and whatever, you didn't really reject them, but rather you found them. So C is the answer. I don't know why I crossed it out. I meant to circle it. So C is automatically the answer, but let's look at the last one. Said a marine disease ecologist. Yeah, because that's the type of marine ecology studies. Or I mean to cross it out. Answer. Now let's move on to another section, which is sentence completion. It says sentence completion consists of a short text, 1 to 2 sentences, or 2 words have been removed. To answer the question correctly, you need to find the option A to D that has the 2 words that are missing in the text. Here's an example. When I was blank, I always thought my classes were very difficult and feared that when I got older, my blank would be impossible. I feel like we can automatically infer that the answer is D. Why? Because let's look at the other choices. Why? Because when I was a child, I always thought my classes were difficult and feared that when I got older, my movement, no. The first part makes sense. The second part does not make sense, making the whole answer wrong. When I was wiser, I always thought my classes would be difficult and feared that when I got older, my mission would be impossible. This does not really make sense. The first part does not make sense. The second part could potentially make sense. When I was abroad, I always thought my classes were very difficult and feared when I got older, my past would be impossible. This makes sense. This doesn't make sense, making it not the answer. When I was younger, I always thought my classes would be very difficult and feared that when I got older, my studies would be impossible. This makes perfect sense. Both of the choices fit perfectly in the choice. And you can read this justification of why this is the answer, but let's move on to number 11. Number 11 says, Impressionism is an art blank that developed in France in the late 19th century. Young artists use new techniques to blank outdoor scenes. So let's look at the first choice. Impressionism is an art movement that developed in France in the late 19th century. Young artists use new techniques to paint outdoor scenes. Well, this could make sense, so we're just going not to cross it out. Let's go to B. Impressionism is an art lesson that developed in France in the late 19th century. Young artists use new techniques to learn outdoor scenes. This makes sense. This doesn't make sense, making the whole answer wrong. Impressionism is an art focus that developed in France in the late 19th century. Young artists use new techniques to describe outdoor scenes. Although this could potentially make sense, it doesn't really fit so much in this context. Impressionism is an art supply. No, it automatically doesn't make sense because it's not an art supply. What is this? We're not doing economics here. Okay, so let's move on to 12. So before I move on, we inferred that the answer is A. Okay, question number 12 says, daily blank improves a person's physical condition. It helps oxygen circulate through your body and it makes your heart and leg blank stronger. We can automatically infer that it has something to do with a physical activity. So we can cross out cooking, we can cross out reading, and we could probably cross out D. Why? Because daily rest improves a person's physical condition. It helps oxygen circulate through your body and makes your heart and leg much stronger. Although this could fit, daily running improves a person's physical condition. It helps oxygen circulate through your body and makes your heart and leg muscles stronger. This fits more. Why? Because this one fits, rest fits, much doesn't really fit, so it makes C the answer. Number 13. Sudoku is the fastest growing puzzle in the world. The blank started in Japan in the 1980s until a few years ago nobody in Europe had ever blank about it. Okay, We're gonna skip the first sentence because it has no fill in the blank. So the government started in Japan in the 1980s. Until a few years, nobody in Europe had ever talked about it. Well, no, because the government has nothing to do with this game. So talk makes sense, government doesn't make sense. The people started in Japan in the 1980s. Until a few years ago, nobody in Europe had ever thought about it. Well, not really, because this in context doesn't make as much sense. So, the practice started in Japan in the 1980s. The practice makes sense. Until a few years ago, nobody in Europe had ever set about it. Set about it. No, it doesn't make sense. Why? Because what do you mean set about it? That's not a correct answer. So, the craze started in Japan in the 1980s. Craze makes sense. Until a few years ago, nobody in Europe had ever heard about it. This answer is the correct answer because both fit the blanks. And now let's move on to 14. 14 says, some recent studies blank that, contrary to previous belief, some saturated fats really contain anti-aging blank. Okay, so we're supposed to look for the best fit answer. So some recent studies show that, contrary to previous belief, some saturated fats really contain anti-aging benefits. This honestly makes perfect sense, but let's continue to see why the rest don't make sense. Some recent studies prove that, contrary to previous belief, some saturated fat really contain anti-aging harms. So we're supposed to look at the contrary previous belief, which is probably that saturated fats are harmful. So we're supposed to look at the opposite, that they are showing benefit. So B is not the answer because it's still showing the contrary belief. Okay, so some recent studies assume that, contrary to previous belief, some saturated fat really contain anti-aging surge. That makes no sense. Some recent studies propose that, contrary to previous beliefs, some saturated fats really contain anti-aging results. This makes sense. This doesn't really make sense, making the whole answer wrong. Okay, so number 15. It is hard to imagine how things were before blank were invented. We certainly couldn't blank information as easily as we can now. So, it's hard to imagine how things were before computers were invented. We certainly couldn't get information as easily as we can now. We can automatically infer that the answer is A, but let's look at the rest of the choices. How things were before television were invented. We certainly couldn't print information. No, you can't really print from a television. Or before clocks were invented, we certainly couldn't originate. No, because you can't really derive information from a clock other than the time. How things were before cars were invented, we certainly could build information. No, because you don't really build information from a car. It just gets you from location A to location B. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next section, which is reading comprehension. Okay, so it says, reading comprehension questions test your ability to read a passage and answer questions about it. Examples of questions are those that ask you to identify the main idea of the passage, find specific piece of information, to guess the meaning of an unknown word from the context, and to identify an opinion in the passage. Okay, so there's 4 things that they could ask you from a reading comprehension. So the first passage. Before we get into the passage, this passage consists of simply 2 paragraphs, so it's considered a short passage because it's not very long. So there's 2 ways to go about this. When there's a short paragraph, you can either skim the whole thing for general understanding and then go back to scan for the answer, or you can read the first line and then scan the rest and then read the last line. Not line, sentence, not the last line, but rather the last sentence. Okay, so let's go with the first method, which is skimming and then scanning. So skim and scan. And what's the difference between skimming and scanning? So skimming is just reading for general understanding, it's fast, and scanning is just going back to the text and locating the answer. So it's a reading for a specific answer. So we're supposed to skim. So while there's more than 1,000 types of different bananas around the world, most of us sadly only know Cavendish variety. They definitely are not the most delicious. The title belongs to ice cream bananas, which can be found easily in Hawaii as well as other tropical environments, Southeast, Central America. At its most ripe stage, its texture is fluffy and creamy, and it's practically melts in your mouth. Okay, so let's get started with the question and come back to scan for the answer. Which of the following is an opinion? Ice cream bananas can be found in tropical environments. No, that's a fact, because it's stating a fact. The most well-known variety of banana is Cavendish. Yeah, that's not the answer because they stated it they said most of us sadly only know Cavendish variety. So ice cream bananas are the most delicious flavor. This could be an opinion, so let's look at the last answer. Cavendish bananas travel well. Well, this is a fact they stated because they said that bananas are healthy and can survive overseas, but they're definitely not the most delicious, but that's not the part. It said they can survive overseas, meaning that the answer is C. Let's move on to 17. The word practically in paragraph 2 is closest in meaning to... Okay, so let's look back. We're going back to scan. At its most ripe stage and texture is fluffy and creamy, and it practically melts in your mouth. Okay, so meaning it's closest to parts, no. Never, no. Almost, potentially. D, actually. It actually melts in your mouth, or and it almost melts in your mouth. It's almost, meaning that the answer is C. Let's move on. Okay, so this passage consists of 3 little longer paragraphs. So what we can do is another method, which is reading the first 4 lines and then reading the last 4 lines and then going back and scanning for the answer. Okay, expanded trade and increased money supply and the push for overseas empires spurred the growth of European capitalism, or an economic system in which most businesses are owned privately. Entrepreneurs or people who take on financial risks to make profits were key to the success of capitalism. Okay, so we read the first 4 lines. What you can do is, maybe I should write this method down. So read first 4 lines, last 4 lines, and skim the middle. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, and this is method number 1. And then when you go back, you scan for the answer. Okay, let's go back. Now we read the first 4 lines. Let's scan the rest. As trade increased, entrepreneurs sought to expand in overseas ventures. They allowed people to pool large amounts of capital needed for overseas ventures. Individuals who invested in these companies could join in any profits that the company made. If the company lost money, individuals would only lose their initial investment. So we went by this method. There is also another method I would like to show you. So you read the topic sentence of each paragraph and then you read the conclusion. So topic, sentences, then conclusion, then you come back and scan for the answer later. Scan for the answer. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that's method number 2. Let's start with the questions. What made private businessmen take their business abroad? Well, now we're supposed to look for this answer in the text. Did they take their business abroad to increase trade, available transportation? That's an automatic no. Because they needed more workers, potentially because they were new free trade agreements. No. So the answer could be increased trade or they needed more workers. Let's look back. As trade increased, entrepreneurs sought to expand in overseas ventures. So because they wanted to increase trade. Let's look at 19. 19 says, what did the price revolution lead to? So, did it lead to more production costs? Did it lead to a push for capitalism, greater resources, taking more risk? Well, as we were reading, in, I believe, the first paragraph, they talked about the price level evolution leading to a push for capitalism. What is one important effect of the increased importance of banks? Okay, so was it greater sharing of profits, joint stock companies, money lending, or fewer losses? Well, it's automatically not fewer losses because we know that they didn't really mention that. So, what's one important effect of the increased importance of profit? Okay, let's look back in the text. Okay, so they said allowing merchants to lend money. Okay, so that means that the answer is C because that's the important effect of the increased importance of banks, which is money lending. Okay, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please, please, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And email me if you have any questions, wizworksyt@gmail.com. So we just finished the verbal section of this PDF, and the next video is going to be the quantitative section of this PDF.